for yourself?
Having a good time.
I'm sure. Yeah.
It's about to be like prime good time for them over there Saturday evening.
No, right. Well, probably.
Okay, so since it's Saturday, in the interest of time, I would like to keep with the schedule. So that you know, we have our last speaker of today, and then after that, immediately after that, we're going to have a panel. And there'll be 4 people in the panel plus me. I'm not necessarily going to say anything, although I might. But, and we're just going to sit here. So the panel will have a little longer, about an hour duration or so. Okay? Very good. So our last speaker of the conference is our own Adina Roskies. She is really a person that lives in both worlds of philosophy and neurosciences, having done work and continuing to do work in both of them, which is a very rare thing, you know. So I think she is absolutely very well positioned to put this into good context. I think this whole debate about free will and the role of neuroscience in understanding it or not. So her talk is called Free Will in the Age of Neuroscience. Adina, thanks.
So everybody can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So before I start, I wanted to thank Marcelo for organizing this and for getting what a fantastic grant with a great mission, and all my fellow speakers who have made this a really wonderful conference and are really hard acts to follow. So I'm kind of not relishing being the one to bring up the end here, but yeah, so what I wanted to talk about today is the impact that neuroscience has on the philosophical problem of free will, and to maybe illustrate ways in which science can illuminate things, and the fact that even if it does illuminate things, it doesn't obviate the need for philosophical work. I will try to highlight when we're doing one or the other, but I think a lot of these disciplinary boundaries are somewhat conventional or elusive anyway. It's not clear to me necessarily when one is being a philosopher, when one is being a neuroscientist, except at the extremes. So let's just start out. Like Seth, I'm not going to define free will. That's a really hard thing to do, and probably a mistake as a methodology. But I'll start with some platitudes, some things that we take to be true, that make it recognizable as free will. And so one is that we think that free will is essential, or at least important, for doing something, being morally responsible for doing something. So if someone doesn't do it freely, we don't hold them responsible for it, or at least responsibility is mitigated. And to do it freely suggests that they could have done otherwise, right? So if one A, here I say A is standing for doing some act, so if one A's freely, one could have refrained from Aing. And another intuition we have is that we also, if we're responsible for doing something, we're doing it freely, we're aware of doing it, we're doing it consciously, and so we consciously will to do that thing. If people don't consciously will to do something, somebody epileptic has a seizure and hits somebody in a car, we don't consider them morally responsible for having done it, unless, of course, they knew ahead of time that they had this problem and they didn't take appropriate measures to alleviate the danger. So those are just platitudes that I think our discussion of free will has to pay at least some kind of attention to. Whether it wants to ultimately reject some of those things in the end is a further question we won't get to today. And what I'm going to talk about today are 2 different threats to the idea of freedom and consequently also possibly moral responsibility. One is determinism, and another is threats to conscious will, the idea that we actually, when we act, we do it with a conscious will. All right, I have this thing. So here I can define something. So here's what I mean by determinism. Determinism is it is what it is, such that a complete specification of the state of the universe at T and the laws are sufficient for fixing the state of the universe at any other time or all other times. That is, there's no additional factor, no place for chance to enter to change the trajectory of the world as it evolves over time. So that's what a sort of technical definition of determinism. And in large part, the debates in philosophy have focused on the importance of determinism for the question of whether or not people have free will. So here's just a rough outline of different positions people can take. So people take a position on whether or not we have free will if determinism is true or if determinism is not true. So suppose the universe is deterministic. If you also think that it's compatible with determinism to have free will, so if you're one of those people who thinks we have free will and the universe is deterministic, then you're called a compatibilist, or sometimes a soft determinist. But you might think the universe is deterministic, and ipso facto we don't have free will. That is, it's incompatible with free will for the universe to be deterministic. So that's a hard deterministic position. But you might also think that the universe is indeterministic. And if you think that the universe is indeterministic and it's in virtue of the indeterminism of the universe that we are able to enjoy free will, then you're what is called a libertarian. These two groups, the libertarians and the hard determinists, are united as incompatibilists because they take it to be evident, or maybe self-evident, that you can't possibly have free will if determinism is true. And so what they vary on is whether or not determinism is true. Now that's presumably an empirical fact, and so it might be something that science has something to say about. So this has not been lost in the history of philosophy. So Spinoza, long ago, said, men are mistaken in thinking themselves free. Their opinion is made up of consciousness of their own actions and ignorance of the causes by which they are determined. Their idea of freedom, therefore, is simply their ignorance of any cause for their action. And so his view was really that determinism is true, and people think they're free, but they're mistaken. They're mistaken because they don't understand what the causes of their actions are. We're in a very different position in society now than he was then in terms of the state of science, what kinds of things we can investigate. And so, at least conceivably, we're in a position to escape from this kind of ignorance that allows people to falsely believe that they're free. And so the brain sciences are one way in which we might be able to escape from this ignorance. They give us some kind of insight into the causal basis of our behavior. We also have new kinds of technologies that we can use to deploy in order to figure out what the causes of our behaviors are. And then there are these cross-disciplinary efforts, melding techniques and insights from different kinds of disciplines, like neuroeconomics, brain imaging, et cetera, to try to approach these questions about what the causes of our behavior are. So maybe we can escape from ignorance. What would be the societal impact of that? So some people, here's a neuroscientist, Jeff Shaw, who thinks that it'll just show us that we're not free. He says, by monitoring the signals produced by appropriate neurons, an experimenter can predict and even influence what a monkey will choose. Ethics, not theory, would preclude an investigator from obtaining the same relationship with a human agent. Can this ability to predict and influence be reconciled with a belief in freedom and responsibility? So Jeff thinks not. He's a neuroscientist, but some philosophers go further in their thinking. They're more interested in what the societal impacts will be should we come to realize that we're not free. So Saul Smolenski thinks that, in fact, it's true, free will is an illusion, but it's an illusion that should only be recognized by the elite, because if everyone else were to figure out that that's the case, society would just crumble. So he thinks that we should continue to keep people in the dark unless they're sort of able to come to terms with this fact. He thinks our fundamental values, practices, and attitudes, such as abhorrence about the punishment of the innocent, the inherent value we put on equality of opportunity, belief in our potential for blameworthiness, are all very likely to be harmed, and people might succumb to an unprincipled nihilism. But not all philosophers think that coming to realize that we don't have free will is such a bad thing. So Josh Green and Jonathan Cohen actually think that it would be very salutary to find out that people aren't free and that we would stop mistreating them for the bad things they do. So they think people don't really deserve punishment because nobody's really responsible for anything. And they're very consequentialist in the way they look at the world. What we really need to do is what's instrumentally the best. So they say, the law will continue to punish misdeeds as it must for practical reasons, but the idea of distinguishing the truly deeply guilty from those who are merely victims of a normal circumstance will seem pointless. What makes these people, at least, what they all agree about is that free will doesn't really exist. And I'm not actually going to tell you whether or not it exists in this talk, but I'm going to question whether the kinds of evidence that they're paying attention to really have the implications that they think that they have. So the basic idea is that if science were to show that our brains are deterministic, it would be, the consequences would be bad, and that science does show that determinism is true. And I think that even on theoretical grounds, this is not the case. So I think Seth had it right. Science, and especially neuroscience. So I'm going to really talk about neuroscience, and the question of whether physics can weigh in on this is sort of a further question we can save for later. But neuroscience, I think, cannot tell us whether or not determinism is true about us. So there are two reasons. One I call the problem of fundamental neural indeterminacy. And that's basically that just looking to see whether things are predictable, which is really the tool that we have for deciding whether brains are deterministic or not deterministic, is insufficient for deciding whether determinism is true. So think about or distinguish what I'll call apparent determinism from metaphysical determinism. So apparent determinism is just, it looks like things are acting in a predictable way such that they must be determined. Whereas metaphysical determinism is what's truly deeply determined. That is, if you really knew what the laws of nature were, you would see that the specification of the state of the system at any given time plus the laws are sufficient to specify the state at any other time. And really for the question of free will, at least in the way it's traditionally framed, that's what really matters. The apparent stuff, not such a problem. But notice that we have sort of cross-cutting of predictability or apparent indeterminism or determinism with metaphysical. So chaotic systems, for instance, look unpredictable. But you can generate chaotic systems from completely deterministic equations. So you can have deterministic unpredictability, as in chaos, and you can similarly have, at least we think, indeterministic predictability, such as in macroscopic objects, given that quantum mechanical systems are indeterministic. So a large enough quantum mechanical system won't behave probabilistically. At least we won't see it. And so those are cases where the apparent determinism or indeterminism cross-cuts the metaphysical, and so merely saying that, well, this system is predictable is insufficient to guarantee that it's a deterministic system. And I could, in another longer talk, walk you through examples in neuroscience where things that look like they're behaving deterministically are actually at some level down behaving stochastically, and then another level down look deterministic, and that keeps going until you get outside of the realm of neuroscience down to the level of basic physics. Another reason why I think neuroscience is not going to tell us whether we are deterministic systems is that our brains are just so incredibly complex and interconnected that we can't get complete descriptions of them. So actually let me go back here. That's a circa, 1990-ish diagram of the wiring of the visual system, but what you're seeing are not connections between neurons, you're seeing connections between brain areas, each of these areas having millions or more, a billion neurons or something, and you can see how complex that diagram is. But this one I think is even more illustrative. So here's the wiring diagram of the only organism for which we know all the connections, the nematode. So 302 neurons. These are all the connections that are made between those 302 neurons in an incredibly simple system. If you think of the fact that we have something like 10 to the 12th neurons, each of those neurons has something like 1,000 synapses with other neurons. We're up in the level of 10 to the 15th connections. There's no way we can monitor what's going on at all of those things at the same time in order to know whether the system is behaving in the way that you would predict. You would really need to have global knowledge of the system, and that's, I think, unattainable by neuroscience. So at this point, I could say neuroscience can't tell us anything about free will. We can move on, but I think that's also not true. So there are ways to operationalize free will that may, so again, without defining it, that may at least pick up on things that we consider important to our intuitive understanding of free will. And here are 5 that I've identified: initiation, intention, decision-making, executive function, and phenomenology, or the feeling that we're free. I'm only going to have time to talk about a couple of these, or 3 of these today. So I'll talk about initiation, intention, and decision-making. And I'll just kind of briefly run through some of the things that neuroscience has said and question what we should take away from that. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are LIBET-style experiments. Many of you have probably heard of these, and this is concerned with what it is that initiates our actions. So this is where the question of conscious will comes in. The sort of popular reading of Libet studies is that what he's shown is that we don't really make decisions, our brains do. And he does this by showing, or actually presuming to show, that the signal for a decision having been made occurs before we're aware of it being made. So I'll run you through this experiment pretty quickly. So the task that he asks people to do is to move their finger or to move their wrist, and he says, just do it spontaneously whenever you feel the urge to. And he puts electrodes on their heads and then records signals from the EEG while they're doing this task. And so you get a bunch of, people do this a couple times, a bunch of times, and you superimpose the signals that you get from the EEG, average to the time at which they move, and you get an average waveform, and that is called the RP, or the readiness potential, which he thinks is the preparatory activity for volitional movement. And now this has been replicated many, many times. It does exist. You can get this signal by averaging over many trials when people do voluntary movements. But Libet added one more element to this task, and he wanted to know, well, we know when the timing is of these brain activities, but we don't know when you're aware of having will to do something. And so then he had people do this task while looking at a clock that had a moving dot. So the dot moves around in the circle, and what you're supposed to do is to identify where the dot is when you feel the urge to move your hand, and report where the dot was so that they can figure out at what time did you feel the urge or make the decision to will to move. So he aims to measure the time of consciousness with respect to this decision to move. And with respect to the neural activity that he can record. And to make a long story short, what he finds is in cases where he's just asking people to spontaneously move, the signal starts about 500 milliseconds before they actually move. The signal from the brain starts about 500 milliseconds before they actually move. However, the average time at which they report to have will to move is after that. It's about 200 milliseconds before they actually move. And so his conclusion is, your brain has decided here that you're going to move, but you only become aware of making the decision later. And so this is an illusion that you have control, because what's really driving the process is this brain activity here. Now, there are many, but one other interesting thing he says is, if there's any room for free will, it's actually in this little window between the time at which you will and the time at which your brain sends out the motor signal to move. So you might be able to change your mind even though the process is sort of uncontrolled by you. That's the idea of free won't. So there are many, many ways in which I can criticize this experiment. I'll pick out just some of them. So first of all, the tasks that people are given are not decisions about whether to move, but they're decisions about when to move. People are following instructions. You might not even think that what they're doing is, sort of a paradigm case of free will, but certainly not a paradigm case of free will that we care about. When we're interested in free will, we're typically, wondering, did the guy pull the trigger or push the person on purpose? Did they make a decision that has consequences? Did they think about those consequences? When you're sitting in a laboratory and the guy says, spontaneously move your arm, you're not in that kind of situation. We're not assigning responsibility. It's not one of those questions where free will really is salient. Now, LIBET, I think, had this idea that, well, if I can make this argument for very simple movements with, like moving your finger, then we could sort of build up a bigger picture of complex action, and it would follow the same kind of routine. We could make the same inferences just from the simple model system. But it turns out that's also not the case. And so if you're looking at brain activity, it turns out it's a lot more, your brain thinks it's a lot simpler to do something like move your entire hand than it does to move your single finger. So actions aren't actually composed out of little atomic bits of action. The way the brain organizes information is quite different. But typically when we're really interested in questions of free will, we're interested in much longer timescales than this, periodically will your finger to move. And there's a lot of evidence from psychology that your conscious willing has effects. So one example is Goldwitzer's implementation intention. So, if people think about and make a commitment to do something like, a monthly breast self-exam, or think about their commitment to not having the French fries that I ate with my lunch or something like that, they are much more effective at implementing their will when they think about things and make these antecedent commitments, but the timescales are not on the timescales that LIBET's really, experiments are really working. But here's, I think, one of the more interesting ways of deflating this work, and that is that I don't think he's measuring the time of conscious willing at all. So if you think about what's going on when he says to move your finger and at the same time index when you will to move to what's going on this clock, there are a couple different components to that task. So first, you're spontaneously moving your finger, but then you're also reporting the time that you're aware of the intent to move your finger. And that itself is a complex thing. You have to recognize that you have this intention to move. You have to look at a clock and index what place on this clock the dot is when this first thing is satisfied, that I have an intention to move, and then report the result of that. This requires an attentional shift, and we have lots of experiments that show that shifting attention is something that takes time. But even more importantly, this recognizing one's own intention to move, is a metastate. It's a mental state about a mental state. You can't have that mental state that's about the mental state until after you have the mental state that it's about, right? And so it depends on the time of willing. It is not itself the time of willing. And because it depends on it, it has to happen after. So if we look at this, this is just an illustration. So you might think that, I'm driving down the street and I see a stoplight and let's say it's orange, and I have to decide whether I'm going to stop or go. The time when I consciously will it is when I think stop and I push on the gas pedal. It's not when I think, oh, now I have an intention to stop, right? This is what we're interested in, which is conscious will. And this is what LIBET is measuring, which is a state that's about conscious will, not the state that we're actually interested in. And so if you look at the graph that I put up before, that's the result of the LIBET study, what he identifies as the time of conscious will is really the consciousness of intention, whereas the intention itself, or the willing, has to happen before. And we don't know when that happens. It could be anywhere along here. There are other reasons that I'm not going to go into for why I think this is a really bad experiment, at least for showing what he wants to show. But I will leave it behind and just say that None of the experiments of the LIBET type have given us evidence that we, in fact, don't have efficacious conscious wills. Another way in which these LIBET type experiments have been done is with brain imaging studies, and there the timescales are a little bit different, and I'll give you an example of that. But brain imagers, at least some of them, think that we can now image the intentions that people have and read their minds. So I'll give you an example of one study in which they claim to be reading intentions, and we'll discuss that. So let's just hope that works. Not yet. Let's see.
John Dylan Haynes is hard at work here, using the scanner not just to identify objects people are thinking about, but to read their intentions.
So we're going to start now with the actual experiment.
Subjects were asked to make a simple decision, whether to add or subtract two numbers they would be shown later on. Haynes found
let's say that this is correct, that you can tell whether a person is planning to add or subtract by looking at their brain activity. In fact, what I would say that at least given the current techniques that we have, we don't know whether the brain activity that he's looking at is actually somehow determining whether they add or subtract, or merely correlated with whether they add or subtract. But suppose you can identify, so he thinks we can read the intentions, whereas all we can really do is predict on the basis of what people have done in the past, what they're going to do, and also not with certainty, but with some probability. So it's not determining the fact that they have to add or subtract. It's merely describing, or it's one way of reading off what their plans are. But this, in and of itself, doesn't have anything to do with free will. All it suggests is that there's some physical basis for the activities, these higher level cognitive activities, in this case, that we're studying. It would be really surprising if that weren't the case. I mean, unless you're a dualist and you think, well, the brain really has nothing to do with our behavior, you shouldn't be surprised at the fact that we can find signals in the brain that correlate with our behaviors. Here's another study where they actually profess to have proven that we don't have free will. So in this study, people again are asked to, in this case, not add or subtract, but to decide whether to push buttons with their right or their left finger. And Haynes and colleagues suggest that they can predetermine or foresee whether somebody is going to decide to press the right or the left button about 7 seconds before they themselves know whether they're going to press the right or the left button. Now, if you could really do that every single time, that would shake things up a bit. And the discussion in the paper suggests that we can predict whether people are going to move their right or left hand 10 seconds before they know that they are going to. But that's not at all what the data says. So if you look at the data here, this is not here, but this figure is showing the area that they found from which they can make these predictions. So they're right about 57% of the time. If they were guessing, they'd be right 50% of the time. So they're slightly better than chance at telling whether people are going to move their right or left hand. And this isn't even the place where he said that he can read off intentions. This is just a place in the brain that happens to correlate with whether or not people move their right or left hand. And if you think about it, if you're stuck in a scanner and people say, okay, you have to just decide on each trial whether to move your right or left hand, you might be thinking, well, I moved my left hand 3 times in a row, and maybe it's time to move my right hand. And you're keeping a record of what you've done in the past that has some kind of correlation with the kinds of things you're going to do in the future. And so all you need is some information in the brain that's correlated with your future actions, and that'll give you a little bump over 50%, and that's sufficient to explain all their data. And so nothing that they've shown suggests that we're determined, that we couldn't have changed our minds, that we had to push with the right or the left. All they're saying is that there's something in our brain that our past matters to our future decisions, is maybe another way of putting it. And it's a good thing that it does, because if we acted randomly all the time, then I think we wouldn't talk about having free will at all. So there's nothing here, I think, that challenges any of our notions of free will. So the upshot from these studies, some studies suggest there's decodable brain activity or information when an intention is consciously held in mind. This in and of itself is no challenge for free will. Other studies suggest that some causal factors are detectable prior to decisions and influence those decisions, but there's no evidence that this is an intention, and it's exactly what we would suspect whether or not we had free will. And nothing, and I'll take my word for it, nothing that I've seen in the neuroscience literature has really seriously called into question our notions of free will at all. Nothing that suggests that our actions are determined prior to us executing them. So what I'll talk about now is decision. And how much time do I have, by the way? Not much. Ooh. -2. Oh, all right. I'll talk about decision really fast. So there's been a lot of interesting work on decision making in monkeys with single-cell recordings. And to summarize a lot of data, I will tell you, here's the task that the monkeys do. They have to decide which direction the majority of dots are moving, and you can alter the coherence of these dots. So here's one with pretty low coherence, and you can decide whether you think that they're moving to the right or the left. Here's one with greater coherence, and you can decide that. That's a lot easier. To basically make a long story short, what they found is there are brain regions that seem to keep track of the strength of the evidence from the visual display. They're measuring the motion signal, and there are brain areas that seem to integrate that over time, and that when those signals that are integrating over time the strength of the evidence reach some kind of threshold level, the monkey makes a decision and acts. They've also found that this kind of mechanism can incorporate other kinds of information, such as probability and value signals. And so essentially you can take what people think of as a decision theory and map it onto neural mechanisms. All of that is consistent with another way of describing this, which is we make decisions on the basis of evidence or for reasons, and when our reasons outweigh the other reasons or the evidence is really good, we can make a decision. So there's nothing in this way of realizing decision-making that's in conflict with the way that we intuitively think about decision-making. So what we get from this is, I think, very interesting results that tell us a lot about how we work, and they suggest that decision-making is in part due to the operation of low-level neural mechanisms. But notice that that doesn't mean anything about determinism. Mechanistic does not equal deterministic or indeterministic. And what it does do, though, is it has to put some constraint on our descriptions or our theorizing about what it is to make decisions. And that is, it has to be in the context of mechanism. And that's really what naturalistic science has been telling us for a long time. There are reasons that thinking of ourselves as mechanism might threaten our ideas about free will, but not for the traditional reasons about determinism or indeterminism. And I think that largely it's because we have this sort of intuitive notion that anything that's a mechanism can't be a mind, that if it's mechanistic, it's not minded. And I think that what the cognitive science and neuroscience aims to do right now is to show us how you get mind out of mechanism and to sort of lay bare that kind of mystery, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a mystery that undermines ideas like the ideas of agency and free will. Can I do this? So I'm not saying that this is not a challenge to the way that we intuitively view the world. So here's a nice illustration of what I'll call the sort of metaphysical dumbfounding that this mechanistic view brings on. So the little dog says, do you think that chemistry of the brain controls what people do? And Dilbert says, of course. But then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that free will is not part of the brain? Of course it is, but it's the part of the brain that's out there just kind of being free. So you're saying the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics? Obviously, otherwise we wouldn't blame people for anything they do. Do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just float nearby? And at this point, here's no more answers. And so there is a philosophical problem there. There is a problem. There's some need to reconcile the manifest and the scientific images, and that's what philosophy is good for. Philosophers have found ways of trying to talk about free will in the context of mechanism, and I think I'm going to leave it at that. I'll just summarize by saying what neuroscience doesn't tell us or tells us. So I think that, as I said before, no result from neuroscience undermines our ordinary notions of free will. A lot of neuroscience is starting to show us what our voluntary actions are like at some fundamental level. And it does give us inductive evidence for materialistic and mechanistic basis for cognition. So now I've forgotten who said it, but somebody yesterday made the very correct point that you can't rule out the existence of God, even if you've explained everything else, right? It could always sit there nearby. And similarly for mine, Mary Jane was the one? Yeah. Materialism might be false, but everything we know so far is consistent with it. But neuroscience can't solve the philosophical problem of free will. And in fact, to really address that problem, I think it's beholden to the philosophy. And I think I'll just leave it at that. And thank you.
Let's see, we are a little late, but we have time for a few questions, maybe a couple. I think this is on. Do we have questions? Rebecca.
I have so many, actually. Well, one is actually going back to the LIBET. Your point that that it's two different states, to will and then to have the intention and then to be aware that you have the intention.
Yep.
It could be argued, I think, that they have to be collapsed into one state, that you're not, having an intention unless you are aware of having the intention. That I could see an argument being made for that.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree. One could make the argument. I don't think it's a knockdown argument, but you could, say something about the transparency of these kinds of mental states, and that. It's certainly not the case that all of our intentions are conscious intentions. Yeah. So I think that's pretty easy to deflate.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
and also with the RP, wouldn't you expect that there would be some kind of lead up to making an intention? Wouldn't you? The intent, it just doesn't come out of nowhere, right?
Right.
Nothing does, really.
Right.
It's
not surprising.
It's not surprising.
No,
it's what you
agree.
would expect. And so, one more thing. Why do you think that neuroscientists are so eager to inflate these results and to deny us free will, right? What do you think is going on there?
Well, most of my answers are not particularly charitable.
Good.
You get good press from saying outrageous things. You get your papers published in better venues, often. But you also, and maybe this is a little bit less accusatory, you also get to dispel a phenomenon that you're uneasy with, that you don't know how to deal with, right? If this is the end of it, then I don't have to deal with philosophy. I've just shown that there is no free will. But I suspect more of it is that it's very sexy sounding.
Just to add to that, the Jeff Shaw, the neuroscientist who made the case that neuroscience can predict and control the behavior of monkeys and what's stopping them from doing that with humans is ethical. He's actually making Rebecca's point from yesterday of a scientist making an argument about free will with bad philosophy, because it raises the question of where does that ethical restraint even come from?
Yeah. I mean, I think, well, he's largely right in saying it is an ethical question. We could interfere with people's brains and control their behavior or affect their behavior, and there are ethical prohibitions. So in that sense, he's correct. Comes from free will, in a sense. Well, I think where ethics comes from is a really interesting question. So it's not clear. On some views, it might come from free will. On other views, it's out there, and we just need to get the right kind of access. But yes, intuitionists about ethics.
So this is a question of scope, but if a scientist ever did prove, at least on like a small scale or like with one human being or one, type of animal, that you could like pretty accurately not just predict the actions, but also understand the source of their actions, would it, like in the long term, would that be a useful finding? Because could we ever really like test those patterns out in the world, right? It's like to determine whether or not I have free will, might you need to have like a clone of me to see, am I going to do this thing every single time? Like, I guess how testable on a large scale are these theories about free will and determinism? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, I think they're not really testable, and the reason is that we're not closed systems. So determinism can be made sense of in a closed system where you know that there's no other influences going on. And we aren't that kind of thing. And so, there is a paper that argues, flies have free will because we gave them the same stimulus multiple times and they did different things. And it's just so naive that it makes me want to cry, but but they're not closed systems.
It's like the physicists that think they understood the Big Bang. Do people ever use mental illness to study free will and the control of mental illness symptoms to kind of see if they, because if you have a psychotic surge, right? I mean, you're going to be doing things that may be against your will or against part of your will. I don't know. And I think there'll be a natural place, being an outsider here, be a natural place to study this, And I wonder if people have done it.
It's pretty hard to say what free will amounts to, such that you would know is it that their will is different when they're ill than when they're not, I mean, we have cases where we want to do something or we know something's the right thing to do and we still do the other thing. Weakness of will, is that an instance of lack of free will? I think those, again, are philosophical questions. I was going to say something more to that, though.
Anger management. Anger management. Let's not even go,
what I was going to say is, what I didn't talk about at all is, I do have a positive view. I have a story of how I think we can be physical systems and still be free. And that story hangs on the existence of certain kinds of capacities. And mental illnesses are an example of people who may lack those kinds of capacities. But at that level, the discussion is quite different. It's not happening at the neuroscientific level, at least at this point.
Yeah. Okay, I'm really sorry, but we really should move on to the panel because we have an hour for that. So Alan, Rebecca, Adam, Frank, Adina, please come over. And while people are getting mic'd up, let me just say what the idea here is. So I invited these people to step back a little bit and reflect on sort of what are the questions that are challenges for bringing the sciences and the humanities into constructive dialogue, so to speak, and what sort of problems we can anticipate for the future, you know, where it's so important to have this dialogue, right? And so it's sort of a short, compact time. They only have about, guys, you should all be sitting here.
No, determinism, as I defined before, that, you know, the specification of the universe.
They'll have about 10
laws
minutes each,
gives you this
and
state of the
and
universe.
then we'll have some time for
Other
question and
times.
answer, hopefully, as well.
So, for
Okay.
instance, I could have a
Anyway,
mechanism
yeah.
that part of it is, you know, a Geiger counter. It's a mechanism, but it's indeterministic the way it'll, right? So you have a mechanism that has.
Because it doesn't know what it's going to come in.
Okay. So, okay, so perfect. It's, the clock is right there. You see the clock there, everybody? I mean, there for the speakers. So about 10 minutes or so each. And since Adina just spoke, I'm going to give you a break. and can we start, Alan?
Okay. Is this on? Do I need
Yeah,
this?
it's on. All the mics are on.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to talk for much less than 10 minutes. But I think that in terms of bringing the sciences and humanities together, that interdisciplinary university courses are a very good thing, where you have courses that are team taught. The same course team taught by a biologist and a economist or a historian. And there are a lot of such courses exist in universities across the country. You probably have some here at Dartmouth that are team taught. I think that also that in such courses, or even in conferences, there should be problems that are intrinsically interdisciplinary, like climate change, bioengineering, limited energy resources, where you need a number of different disciplines coming together to address the problem. I think we should also examine why it is that scientists and humanists have difficulty talking to each other. What are the reasons? I think one reason is just vocabulary. Another is specialization, that even the individual sciences have gotten so specialized now that they're fragmented into lots of pieces. Maybe there are not enough good explainers to cross between different disciplines. I think there's some mistrust, and at different times I've been in groups, and I'm sure everyone here has been, where there are humanists who think that they're superior to scientists because scientists are just robots and are unfeeling and don't know anything about the emotional side of life. And scientists sometimes look down on humanists as being imprecise and sloppy in their thinking and unquantitative and all of that. So we've all experienced this kind of thing. So I think I'll stop there. I think that the salons and conferences of this type are a very good thing, and I've really loved talking to various people here in the last 2 days. So I congratulate again Marcelo for bringing us together.
I've got my own.
Oh, okay.
Thanks.
So we're supposed to go address how to redress this. Yeah.
Yes. It's
Okay.
freewheeling.
So as I see it, there are two levels of problems. One is institutional, and one is human nature. And
Which is harder.
which is harder is a good question, right? So, we've got, sort of a meritocracy in a university, right? People who really pride themselves on how smart they are. And, and if we could somehow change that, so that, it's not about who's smarter here, the scientists or the humanists or the artists. It's really not about this kind of, tribalism and stature. That would be a really good thing. I really have experienced this very much because I started in physics, as an undergraduate. And I think part of the reason, I really loved physics, but I also loved that's what really smart people do, right? And I can do it, and girls can't do it, and I can do it. And there was a lot of that kind of nonsense actually involved. And then when I realized, what I really want to do is philosophy of science, my physics professors and the students, who were going on in physics, I lost quite a few IQ points with them. It was really, I'm going to do philosophy. You don't have to be as smart to do that. And then when I wrote a novel, I lost so many IQ points that people just assume, because idiots can write novels, right? I really experienced that. My former colleagues, I was teaching philosophy at a good place, and my former colleagues just sort of, they kind of would translate down to me, that it was really, I couldn't possibly really wanted to be smart enough to do philosophy because now I was writing novels. There's so much of this kind of stuff going on in the university, and and it's it was, for me, it was very, very painful. I remember my advisor. I was at something, and my former advisor, who I thought quite well of my work. And then when he was going around the table introducing the various people, he introduced me as a novelist. I was no longer a philosopher. If I was doing novels, forget it. You're just. So there's this sort of thing, and I don't know how do we go about maybe just pointing out the stupidity of this. It would maybe do something. And as far as the institution goes, you don't win points for going outside your field. Just the hierarchy exists on the institutional level as well. So whatever stupidity is being assumed on the within the various departments is assumed on the institutional level as well. So we just have to solve all that, and it's going to be good.
I think some of the problem also is categories and how we come at this. So, coming from physics, I have the exact same experience. And it's interesting that, C.P. Snow, when he wrote that essay, was really talking about, the humanists not knowing sort of anything that was going on. He saw the scientists as being much more broadly educated. But in many ways, my own experience has been sort of the opposite, at least about categories and attitudes. That the arts are fine, but there's really nothing going on there fundamentally. I enjoy going to the play, but other than that, end of story. There's no truth happening there. So the categories of truth and the meaning of truth, I think, is part of the thing. Because that truth gets associated with intelligence. Only really smart people can know the truth. And of course, the way the society is constructed, only really smart people, the only really smart people are people who solve math problems, right? That's the ultimate. You see this basically on IQ tests. So for me, a lot of it focuses on what we think is situated within what, right? So much of, because we live in such a technological scientific society, and because physics is also held as the embodiment of the pure embodiment of science, with only mathematics being above it, there's the sense of it's not physics truth, and everything, there lies above it, then really what else are you doing? But the real problem with that is that what we think is, so that the goal should be to situate, life within physics, right? If you can explain all the stuff, even the arts, you're going to be able to reduce it to the atoms. It goes back to determinism, right? The movement of atoms. And what we've really forgotten, which is something that, I think, goes back, like really what the pre-Socratics knew, was that, the goal here is not to situate experience inside some domain of explanation, but the other way around. Explaining is something we do, but it's a subset of this much more raw embodied encounter that we have with the world. That's the mystery, the fundamental, perhaps unpenetrable mystery that it is to be human and to be alive. So the question is really not how to situate life in physics, it's how to situate this one thing we do call physics in this much, broader, quite unfocused and perhaps never fully focusable thing called being, the verb to be. And so, I think if that were remembered and if that were pointed out, if that were, emphasized, then some of this imbalance that we have, that we think everything, if it's not reducible to physics, you haven't even really done anything, would begin, and pointing out the stupidity of people who take this sort of approach. Or it's not something you said about the idea that, people who come up with these theories, that they sound great, but nobody lives that way, right? It's not a lived experience, it's not a lived truth. I think that's really the emphasis. We have to return to the idea, because what does art do? In your beautiful talk today, what does art do but bring us to fundamental truths about ourselves? And those are no less fundamental than, Newton's equations, of mechanics. So it's really the emphasis that, and I think a lot of this is historical because of the way, and it has to do with power relationships. There was that move in the 90s of sort of social constructivist views of science, which I think, there was an element of that which was interesting, but it got kind of crazy, which sort of said, science is just a game that is played, and there's really no truth to it, but it's played, the powerful accept it, right? And that's why everybody does science. But it's really the other way around. Science discovers things about the world, and so for those in power adopt it because it gives them power, right? So part of this is, there are power relationships, social power relationships, that this search for the truth gets co-opted by. So leveling the playing field and recognizing really where things start, which is the verb to be, would, I think, begin to, if we started to make that our focus again, which I think in older times was much more the focus in previous historical eras, and certainly other civilizations, right? I mean, Western civilization is one of the number of cores of civilization that have emerged on the planet over the course of the last 10,000 years. Other civilizations didn't have the same kind of emphasis and discovered a whole bunch of other things about being human that are, the West necessarily, where they were not our emphasis. So to me, it's a category. We need to return to some fundamental categories about what it means to be human, and then ask these questions within that playing field.
That was great. I agree. I mean, maybe another way of phrasing it, I think, is respect. So, it seems like there's often a lack of respect among practitioners of different disciplines within the academy. There's students come in with presuppositions, probably largely affected by their parents' views about what's worth doing. And if there were, I guess I might advocate doing something like forcing all students to do, some science deeply enough that they can understand it from the inside, and some, collection of different arts and humanities enough that they appreciate what a lived life gains from having a close enough relationship with the great things that people before us have done. And if you can get people to appreciate what they themselves get out of understanding art history or something like that, then I think the rest of it becomes a lot easier.
Okay, I'll make a couple of comments too. So, I like to talk about the complementarity of knowledge, complementary in the way that Niels Bohr used the word complementarity, not complementary. In the sense that, we have to think of knowledge in a sort of a pluralistic sense, that you can look at the same question in many different ways, and you can look at the same phenomenon in many different ways. So to make this concrete, consider a glass of wine, right? So you consider a glass of wine, and then you say, okay, what is the wine? Well, it's this chemical fermentation of the grape that is happening here. So you have a whole biochemical way of thinking about the glass of wine. And then you can also talk about the beauty of the crystal and the diffraction of light that is happening there. And you have a physicist's way of thinking about light. And then you can smell the wine and you can taste the wine. And then you have this experiential way of thinking about the wine. And you can then look who you're drinking your wine with. And it can be a very special, emotional moment for you. And that is a very different way of experiencing that very thing, which is the glass of wine. And I think that each one of these different narratives that we construct or that we experience are saying something very important about that glass of wine. And none is taking away from the other. They serve, in a sense, a different purpose. If you're trying to flirt with a new date, and you start discoursing about the biochemistry of wine fermentation, that may be a real bad start for that person, unless, he or she loves biochemistry, But the point is that you can look at these things in many different ways, and they're all meaningful depending on the context of the explanation, right? And I think one of the problems that we face, going back to academia, is, yes, we offer the courses and all that, but when it comes to tenure decision, it is really locked into a department, and if you're an assistant professor, say in philosophy, who is interested in quantum information theory and starts to publish more technical papers in the quantum information theory journals, when it comes time for your tenure decision, that's going to hurt you. Somebody mentioned that. I think Rebecca mentioned that, right? Yeah. And so the very structure of the way we reward intellectual output at the university is constrained by these very big walls. They're very hard to go through, and what can you do? Well, you can start doing these things after you get tenure. That's one solution, which is, I guess, what we all did.
No.
Oh, not you. Rebecca is the exception. You're right.
Braver than the rest of us.
But, yeah.
Stupider.
That's true, exactly. But otherwise, you're sort of locked into a system that does not reward this kind of courageous, outgoing into different fields. And that's, to me, a big problem. The other problem, I was talking to Maria, saying, where are all the students? We have all these awesome people here, and where the heck are the students? There are like 10 of you here, right? And it's Saturday, and they say, well, nobody wants to wake up at 9 in the morning. Okay, but it's not. It's 2, 3 in the afternoon, and we're having the panel, and they're not here. And she said something that I really liked. She said, it's hard with exceptions in the audience. So it's hard to convince an 18 or 20-year-old that these big interdisciplinary questions are questions that are very important to them, and with very few exceptions. It takes a level of cortical maturity that perhaps will come later on, in the 20s and 30s. Well, wow, this is really what it's all about, and I'm sure you all had experiences with talking to alumni that say that if I only knew how important those 4 years were and this exposure to these different ways of knowing, I would have paid much more attention and would have really benefited much more from my exposure to whatever school. And that has always comes, isn't that? I mean, it's amazing, it never fails, right? But how do you get the message out? It's really hard, and it's a challenge, and I don't know what the answer is to that. I thought this was a good start, and I hope it helps some of you, and it shows that there are some people here that get it, right? But it's a very hard one. Maybe if I get Justin Bieber here next time, maybe I get some more people coming or somebody like that. But
It's very interdisciplinary.
but that to me is a challenge, and I don't know what the answer to that challenge is. One thing else that I'd like to say is that it's one way that this institute is trying to make some progress is to force scientists and humanists to address a common topic where a one-sided view just cannot go alone. So we talked about free will, obviously, was something that people talked about, whatever that is, was something that we addressed here. But there are many other questions out there that, for example, transhumanism. So what will happen as we are becoming more and more one with digital appendages, right? And that we begin to transform the way we think of ourselves as humans, completely dependent on this stuff, the cell phone that we have in our pockets here. And if you forget it, it's sort of like desperate all day because it's sort of like forgot part of yourself somewhere. You cannot function without this stuff. So you're not alone. You're not human in the old-fashioned sense. You're now human with this new thing. And this is a progression that is going to continue. And because it's going to continue, you have to consider the thing that actually Phil Hanlon talked about this in the morning. If you start replacing all the parts of a human, what does remain? And so here is not replacing, here is adding different things to the human. What is this new thing that we're becoming? And obviously here you have a scientific component, you have a philosophical component, you have an artistic component to discuss on this. And there are many, many questions like that which are, I think, directly relevant to us. I think you mentioned global warming, or somebody mentioned global warming. Obviously, it's another one. And so we're going to force people to kind of sit down and, okay, so what do you have to say about this? And what do you have to say about this? And what does the public have to say about this? So that we can start an outside of academia only discussion about these questions. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do. Okay, since you guys want to say anything else?
Well, actually, I just, Adam, what you had said, about somehow the pre-Socratics had known this, and that, I was thinking, the notion of human flourishing, that what we really would like our educational institutions to contribute to is human flourishing. And yes, we need science for that. We need we need the arts. I mean, to reach the full potential of eudaimonia, of that ancient, which is often translated as happiness, but it's not. That's the wrong translation. It's something, it's something richer than that. It's the full panoply of human possibilities that what institutions should be devoted to that, if not, the academy, right? That's why the academy was formed by my man Plato, right? Right? Why did he form this place? Sort of a way. That was a big mistake. I mean, maybe Socrates was better off in the agora. Maybe we, the whole ivory tower that we've removed ourselves. Something has gone wrong there. But the notion of what we're really supposed to be thinking about and contributing to here is, figuring out and contributing to the well-being of everybody, to the flourishing of everybody. And, and in that sense, how do you weigh the sciences above the arts, above the humanities? It's all, part of the same picture.
But I was going to say, the problem with that, or the catch-22, is that you already now have a population who doesn't recognize that as the goal.
Yeah.
And you have to start somehow convincing them that it's that and not, boatloads of money or whatever else the new god is.
Exactly.
That we need to work for.
Well, maybe we just have to take the cup of hemlock and, but you're right. I mean, this whole institutional thing has gotten going, and we get ground up in the process, and it's the original idea has been squashed.
And I think actually this speaks to Marcel's point about students, right? Because the great leveler of human life, as Mr. Buddhist pointed out, is suffering, right? Everybody's suffering, you know? So you can have boatloads of money and you're still going to suffer. You're going to suffer just because boatloads of money don't, you know, you can have boatloads of money and then the next day you're still kind of like, what do I do today? So, you know, I think part of the thing for the students is to understand, so much the academy has become now a job training site, right? That's what we sort of think that it's for, and the students think that it's for. But that, you know, these consideration of these big questions is also part, whether it's from the scientific point of view or the artistic point of view, you know, bringing them together in this place of, for me, being, it relieves suffering. It relieves the inherent, this difficult thing of waking up every morning and not knowing what you're doing. These are the ways we approach it. And so to somehow if the students knew that this would actually make them feel better, you know, that part of engaging in these discussions is part of their own, you know, relief from this strange existential dilemma that we all face, you know, which is, I think, also what the original point was. Yeah. That might also be part of that.
Mm.
So, like, as I was saying this morning, is that instead of having the liberal arts as a toolbox, have it as a way of life.
Yeah.
You know, as a way of looking at the world. You know, and that, because we do this, you know, critical thinking, liberal arts, exposure to different things, but then you do it and then you leave it out of their life. And it should really be a way of looking at the world, you know, and perhaps that's the mission of us educators, you know, to kind of be telling that this is not just about writing a good essay where you have different points of view, but it's really about how you look at the world, you know, by bringing together. And you mentioned respect, somebody mentioned respect, but in also the openness to have the intellectual curiosity to hear the other person, right? I mean, you got to say, that person is not from my field, but I can learn from that person. And that to me it takes humility, which is a very hard thing, right? But you need that.
Especially in the academy.
Especially in the academy or in politics. But, and that is extremely important, you know, to be able to have this openness to accept that your knowledge is not complete, that there are other ways of looking at what you're doing that are important to you.
Well, I think that the academy has always been about acquiring knowledge and transmitting it to students. I mean, the trivium and the quadrivium had certain courses that were considered to represent knowledge. And I think the question that we're asking, and to acquire knowledge, you need a certain amount of disciplinarity. You need a certain amount of specialization, because the different fields have different tools, and those tools need to be preserved. But I think the question that we're asking is and this is Rebecca's question about the goal of philosophy, to say what matters is what is the knowledge for? Mm-hmm. That's the question we're asking. Mm-hmm. And I think that we're not doing a good job of conveying that to the students. What is the knowledge for? Mm-hmm. It's not just to get a job on Wall Street. What is it for? And I think if we can convey that question to the students, that the synthesis of the sciences and humanities will be a very natural development.
Right.
Because in that level, the curiosity is the thing, right? Curiosity, you know, awe, we talked about awe this morning, awe and wonder. And, you know, what that part springs out of is to be curious about the world. And, of course, you're not, you know, the idea should you be curious about all of it. You're only here for, you know, 70, 80, 90 years, and, like, all of it is really freaky, right? And to be sort of engaged, whether it's the arts, you know, or how an ant hill works, or, you know, how human behavior in groups, you know, it's just this fundamental sense of, like, what is going on? That unites everything, and if you have that, your life is so much richer, right? Yeah. Then you know, it's not just about money, and it's not just about power, because, you know, it's the curiosity that animates every day that you're alive. So somehow conveying, like you said, I think it'll become natural if we, this union, if we can sort of, give students, awake their curiosity for the whole thing.
So there was this French philosopher from the late 17th century called Bernard Le Bovier de Fontenelle. And he wrote this amazing book called A Conversation on the Plurality of Worlds, which was a dialogue between a philosopher himself and a marquise, who was an amazing thing for the time because, to have a woman protagonist at that time was already very rare, right? And he based his character on this, a woman that actually had all these intellectual salons where they would discuss these ideas, right? But he says something which I think is wonderful in the book, which is to your point, which is he says that all philosophy is the product of two things, curiosity and short-sightedness. And I think it's just right on, right? Because we want to know, but we can't see it all, and hence you have this creative tension, right, between the two things, the wanting to know and not being able to see it all. And but that's what makes it matter, right? And I just had to throw that in.
Yeah. So also, I guess it's becoming, seeming to me, a more and more insurmountable problem because, what you're really asking. When you say, it's not just about the students going out onto Wall Street and making money, is that the academy has to stand in opposition to the values of the culture. And, that would be a very big, whereas what has really happened is the academy has penetrated completely and ruled by the values of the culture, which is, money and fame and all of that existed in ancient Greece, against which the philosophers were themselves rebelling. And that's what we would have to sort of relive. It takes so much money to run a university, and we want the alum to give us money and football team, and it's what's really ruling the university. It's not us,
right.
It's not us wisdom lovers, I don't know. Yeah. So
I think you can co-opt that machinery, though. I think that's real. That's the real politics.
So let's talk about that. How do we do that?
Right.
How do we co-opt?
What about? Sorry.
No.
Should we have?
When you talk about power relations, I can't help think about the way universities treat adjunct professors, and that seems to be a looming issue that's going to come to the forefront pretty soon. And it seems to me that the stratification of knowledge aligns itself with the division of labor, which kind of facilitates that exploitation. So it seems to me that there is an opportunity to, since I think this issue is going to come to the forefront, is going to get popular attention, I think there's an opportunity to align this whole notion of interdisciplinarity with labor fairness, and to bring attention, and we're bringing attention to this, to the nature of the academy.
That's true. But graduate students are organizing the idea that they want to unionize. This has just come to my campus as well, that the graduate students deserve some representation. So I think those two issues are actually aligned in some ways.
Do people from the audience want to speak? Okay.
Thank you. This is a fascinating and really thought-provoking discussion. And I think part of the answer is in what we're all doing here, which is this is an attempt to, at the heart of this institute, to enact a cultural shift, to be one of the first steps, because it's not enough to call liberal arts education. You do a course in this department, and then you do a course in this department, and then you do a course in this department. There's no coherence to that. It's like giving the kids a bag full of glass shards. What we want to do is we want to give them a cup. We want to give them something that can hold and has some coherence. And if we're just saying you have to do X, and put a Y course in there and put a Z course in there, there's no coherence to that, and there's no meaning to that. It's just checking off a list of different departments. And so I think part of this dialogue is what is the meaning and what is the coherence, and how can we start at the top, for people who have a lot of expertise and a lot of power, and how can that start being conveyed to our learners, our learners in college, our learners in elementary school. I mean, maybe it shouldn't be you have a math class and then you have a science class and then you have a writing class. To start having that coherence.
Yeah, absolutely. Margaret, okay, lots of hands. I'll try to get to all of you.
So just very briefly, in the same vein, thank you. I guess I'd like to hear more from the panel about curricular strategies. A couple of you have mentioned a few things that are going on or perhaps might go on. And it seems kind of clear to me that we probably can't change human nature. We probably can't change the wider culture. But one thing that we do have a little influence on is the curriculum of our respective universities as faculty members. Curriculum within our own departments, and perhaps also distributive requirements, very practical things that are required for a degree. Marcelo mentioned interdisciplinary courses. Those go on at many places. I would be interested to hear a little bit more from the panel about whether you feel that interdisciplinary courses, we need more of those. Is that the answer? Or is it more that we need to think about ways that courses within the disciplines, perhaps, can reach out to students are inherently multidisciplinary, right? They have to be, to some extent. And maybe also, how do students and graduate students acquire some of the attitudes in the course of the education we're giving them that are perhaps the very things we find ourselves struggling with? So that's meant to be a question.
Anybody? Anybody want to say anything about that? No?
I had an idea other than purely curricular stuff. It's actually maybe an idea that's easier to put into practice when you're leading a foreign study program or something, but it seems to me that modeling, at least when I was a student, I looked up to my professors. I have no idea whether they feel the same way. But I think modeling the good life in a sense, like what it is to be a complete flourishing person, that, I don't just care about my discipline. I do reach out and I appreciate the arts, and I, make an effort to become this whole person and not sort of a narrow-minded person. And the more you can, model that for students, but bring them into that world, I think, in a sense, it's more important to set the motivation, to get them to feel the need themselves, than it is to sort of funnel things at them. But it's hard to figure out how to do it because there's so much noise from the other parts of the world.
Absolutely.
Can I just one briefly? One thing that the University of Rochester is doing that I really like is the idea of the Take 5, they call it, the 5th year for students. If you maintain a certain GPA or whatever, you can get a 5th year for free, and the 5th year can be whatever you want. You're supposed to build an interdisciplinary. So I just thought that was actually a really nice idea, and I've done a bunch of different projects with students that are really, that I thought were really innovative.
Yeah,
So
that's marvelous. So I just wanted to address, the one point, I'm going to think about this curriculum thing. I think it's a deep question, and I do team teach. And then I'm lucky because now I have a joint appointment with English and philosophy, and so I am, ipso facto interdisciplinary, and I can mix it up in whichever way I want, and I do. But the graduate, what I have seen, becoming a graduate student, becoming professionalized, is, being, indoctrinated into this vocabulary. I mean, it's just funny the way you just start spouting the jargon, and it's, and it's just a very forceful process of what it is, and it's a narrowing process. And it's just sad that as you take the next step to, in the life of the mind, your mind is being narrowed. And that just, I don't know, that just seems that the way it's done here, and I don't know, I don't have any, this is just an observation. I have no, the more I talk about it, the more dispirited I'm becoming.
Yes, so I'm a graduate student, and I'm wondering if you could comment on or give some advice on how to keep our horizons open, the sciences, to the arts and humanities, when implicitly and sometimes explicitly I'm being told you don't have the time to do that. If you want to be in the cutting edge of your subfield of a subfield of a subfield, you have to spend your entire life just reading science articles just to stay present. So how do you deal with that?
That's a big question.
Sacrifice your career? I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
I would say don't. Like for example, when people come to me and ask me about writing, oh, you're a scientist, but you also write. It's like, start a blog. Start a blog and just write about the things you're interested in. Not because you're, hoping to build it, because you want to, because it'll keep your mind alive about these other subjects. So choose the others. Your professor doesn't even have to know. It's just building that into your own life, your own intellectual endeavor. And then later on, maybe you have to, because of the way the world is now, you narrow now for a while, but then you broaden in terms of, at some point you will do research with other people. But it's keep that part alive for yourself. And, nobody else really needs to, not your bigger mentors don't need to know.
How very, very sad that
I know.
You have to
don't tell me you're thinking about other things.
Yeah.
Or try to find a different kind of advisor.
True,
They
but I
exist.
think it's really important, I think, that we as professors recognize that there is that pressure and try to push back against it, right?
Yeah.
Why
Yes.
don't we make it a
Yes.
culture in which that's not what's said?
Yes.
But they do need to learn the techniques.
Yeah.
It is you have to be part of the club, so to speak, and to do that you have to learn a language, and to have a learned language you have to immerse yourself into that. But that doesn't need to be all you do, as Adam is saying. Okay, you can still do other stuff. We were grad students, and we worked real hard with whatever papers we had to read and calculations or books we had to write, but then we do the other stuff, and time management is a wonderful thing, it really is. And if you're good at time management, I promise you will find time to do the other stuff as well. And I think you're so right saying that you have to keep the flame alive there, because otherwise you're going to become the guy that 20 years from now is going to tell your students, hey, you don't have time for this stuff, just go look for the fox and the hedgehog, the essay.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the real problems in academia. Okay.
So I was going to say something else, but I'll preface it by something completely related to this, which is that I started doing what I do my site, Brain Pickings, a decade ago because I felt very disenchanted with the way that academia was addressing this question of meaning. I had come to higher education from Bulgaria to the US, hoping to learn how to be a complete human being, how to flourish, and instead I was told how to memorize and specialize and all of that. And so I started a record of these other ways of inquiry into meaning, and that became my life. But what I was going to say, which is very related, is that now consequently I spent a lot of time with archives and the letters and diaries of great thinkers from the ages. And if you look at most great scientists, they were prolific writers, either of diaries or of letters, which means they were reflective thinkers about matters larger than whatever they were studying in their scientific work. If you look at Newton's diaries, Darwin's letters, Einstein's letter to the Queen of Belgium, which is a letter of consolation on grief and aging and loss, is a masterwork of philosophy and of reflection and of the so-called liberal arts integrated with life as it unfolds. And I think we could say, there are a lot of cultural pressures right now, both on science for practical, demonstrating practical merit, and also in humans, the false urgencies of our prosthetic devices and the cult of productivity, and you could say, well, that's preventing us from integrating this reflective life. But I really do believe that writing and science have always been integrated, and if we're trying to reintegrate them, we should think about facilitating ways in which people can have dedicated contemplative time in writing, because that is the gateway to the humanities and the arts and the integration with science.
That's a very, very, very good point. Yeah, I think it speaks directly to all of us here. Sure.
Ehud's been having his hand up
Sorry?
for a long time.
Then
Ehud.
Ehud.
One of the things I learned quite a few years by now from reading some of the things that members of the panels have written make me suspicious of a planned interdisciplinarity. Because what I learned from you is that it's only looking back at achievements of civilizations that we find out how breakthroughs, insights, discoveries in one domain of human creativity affects others as becoming a model for them that brings about new things in those. The problem with this is that it violates disciplinarity. It violates the illusion of a discipline that itself grounded, and exposes the way in which it is open to metaphorical mapping or some such influence from other domains. So it seems to me that what can encourage this is actually the kind of reflection on the way human civilizations have created these things in order to see how human minds, the social thinking actually works, in order to be open to those dynamics. I don't think we are ever in a position to plan or chart them ahead. They will happen, and they surprise us when we happen. You've written about this a lot. So it's not interdisciplinarity as such, but rather I think a charge of charting the humanities in actually taking up that project. Because if there is a subject the humanities need to deal with, is how human beings interact with different modes of thinking to create new ones. That's not a scientific project. It's not a sociological project, although it has dimensions of all of them. It is a fundamentally humanistic project. And I think the humanities are extremely ill-trained to undertake it.
Yeah. When you're talking about disciplinarity, I just realized discipline. So maybe we don't need cross-disciplinarity, we need indisciplinarity. You know? A little bit of anarchism in the world of ideas may be the way to go.
I think often getting people, in the room together is like the first step. And that's why cities are so much more productive, right? You look at the output of human civilization, the innovation, it's almost always happened in cities. So part of it is just slamming people together who are, may come from very different backgrounds, and then sparks will fly. And so, that's what, in some sense, doing like what this is, even today, right? Just having us all here to sort of talk about sort of common ideas. It's just, history's made by those who show up, right?
Yeah, but I'm interested also in your indicting the humanities to right, if I heard you correctly, that they've in some sense forsaken. And so, there's a way in which they've been so cowed by STEM, where all the money goes, and they're they have this kind of fortress pushback mentality, and so they try to be as jargon laden as the scientists, as impenetrable, creating this language, and when I hear literary scholars analyzing my work, I don't know what the hell they're talking about, right? It's foreign to me, right? And so, theory, is it, theory, there's one theory. This is the way literary scholars talk about theory. And it's, but partly, I think you're right that there is a, and also, the kind of relativism, the homo, and all of that has been, taken on by, in the humanities, that this sort of larger, messier project, they want to make it as neat and as problem-defined as the sciences, and it's not. It's big, messy, struggling with what it means to be human, and how we do it better. And there's a kind of shirking from that in the humanities. So I agree with you.
Hi, I'm a student at a small liberal arts college similar to Dartmouth, but I'm taking a semester off because I've found myself spending so much time thinking about which areas of study I want to look into that I'm struggling to actually focus on doing the work of what I'm doing. So one of the issues I think I've come across is even though I go to a small school where it's discussion-based for the most part, there's still a sense in which the professor is being kind of pedantic and telling us their view on whatever subject they're looking at. And I think, to a certain extent, one way interdisciplinarity can be improved is, I think young students naturally already want to make a lot of connections between different ideas and different subject areas, but when we're sort of asked from an early point to go along with the train of whichever department we're with and take along all the views of our professors, even if we haven't thought through it, we stop thinking about things so interdisciplinarily. So if there's more of, especially in interdisciplinary classes, less of the professors actually telling us how to think interdisciplinary about it, and a lot more of just looking directly at the text or whatever subjects we're looking at, and drawing our own ideas about that. I think that's one helpful thing. And also just kind of wanted to express how as a student, I do indeed see the importance of thinking about all these different things, because I don't see myself as someone who's from an early point chosen the train of the hard sciences, the humanities, and it actually makes it pretty hard when you're not decided. Yeah. And just another thought I wanted to add in is a quote that I think captures the essence of this attitude that we're trying to get here. It's from Aldous Huxley's final novel, Island, which he viewed as his greatest novel and sort of his answer to his utopia to the dystopia of Brave New World. So one of the characters on this utopia states that science is not enough, religion is not enough, art is not enough, politics and economics is not enough, nor is love, nor is duty, nor is action ever how disinterested, nor however sublime as contemplation. Nothing short of everything will really do.
Lovely. Lovely.
Exactly. Let's see. Who do we have? Do you have there? Okay, before I go there, let me just stay close to here, close to this island.
That really was almost a very perfect note to close on. One word we haven't mentioned, but we've come very close, is periphery, boundary, edge. It takes curiosity to travel to the boundary, to the periphery, to the edge. It takes courage, certainly. It may be facilitated in cities where people of different ethnicities and economic and social backgrounds can more easily come together. But very interesting things happen there, and that's what you've illustrated in the work you're doing in this conference this weekend, and what you're looking forward to in the future.
Okay, thank you. Okay, 2 more questions, because Rebecca has to go soon. Let's see, yeah.
how do you differentiate, or how would you differentiate between interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinarity, and multidisciplinarity? The terms are used interchangeably sometimes.
Anybody wants to take this?
I feel like on a certain level, there's something we're trying to do, which is to get people to talk to each other and build a foundation for real inquiry. There's often these questions that everybody has, and people are siloed in their way of looking at them, and also quite disrespectful to other disciplines that are looking at them. And so we're trying to stop that. We're trying to stop that and really understand how can we ask the same questions together and learn from the fact that, like, wow, you're asking the question in a totally different way. So whichever name we use is sort of less important than the thing we're trying to do. And it's really hard. It's really hard given, as you say, the nature of the academy, the nature of this long history of the way questions have been asked. So.
And people just trying to prove how smart they are.
I know, right.
Yeah.
Fiefdom, intellectual fiefdom.
Yeah.
This one took one of my interdisciplinary / cross-disciplinary / multidisciplinary courses. So here you go.
I'm just wondering, it seems like one solution that could come about with this is breaking away the sort of difference between science and the humanities, because in the sciences we have this tree that you guys talked about, starting with mathematics, going to physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and that's kind of the end of that tree, and then you separate and then go over to the humanities somewhere else. But it seems to me that you could be able to explain, in the same way that you can explain physics through mathematics, you could explain art through psychology, and human migration and geography through these lower levels in this tree. And if we put it all underneath one blanket and just try to get communication between this one tree and extend it as far as we can, then that might degrade some of these assumptions we have that, like, oh no, this is the humanities, oh no, this is the sciences. It's all under one tree that starts with mathematics and then ends with this thing to be, right? Like, if we subscribe to metaphysical determinism, then when does it stop being all part of the same structure?
Yeah, so there are people who, have advocated for this, and that the way to revive the humanities is to import some of the sciences, especially evolutionary psychology or neuroscience, to explain, our artistic sensibilities and all, and the themes in literature, so evolutionary literary theory, and I actually, and I think, this is all very good, but this is for the sciences to declare their ultimate superiority and dominion over the humanities. I do think, there's a tremendous amount that evolutionary psychology, that neuroscience, can offer to the humanities, and the tools of science can often be imported into the humanities, but the humanities have something, another toolkit, and another way of approaching these questions. I don't want to see them absorbed into the sciences. I know many scientists who think that's the hope of the humanities. In fact, I'm married to one such person. So I am intimately familiar with this idea, and I resist it.
It's like Wilson's consilience.
Yes,
Let's make
exactly.
everything scientific,
Exactly.
and then everything is unified.
Yes.
How about instead of making it a tree, which is inherently a hierarchical structure, make it into a loop, or make it into a, right, so that, they loop back on each other. There's no place where it starts, so there's no place that's higher. Because again, for me, it's all about the verb to be. That's the undifferentiated weirdness,
And I also think the goals are, in a sense, different. I mean, the goal is not to explain the humanities or the art. I mean, the goal of the humanities or the arts are not things that need to be explained as much as experienced, appreciated, integrated.
My thesis advisor.
That's fine, yes. Thank you.
I mean, it's, you know, like, what does it mean to explain Beethoven's Fifth? You know, you lose Beethoven, it's just not the same thing as listening to Beethoven's Fifth. You might appreciate it more or differently once you understand the structure or something like that, but it just doesn't seem like the subject matter is the kind of subject matter that's asking to be explained in the way that science wants to explain.
So Alan needs to go because he has something at MIT he needs to attend to. You can go out. Well, yeah, there's one last question.
So
it's from my wife. If I don't let her do it,
it's not a question. It's just a brief comment, but it feels like kind of maybe an optimistic synthesis is kind of to close with, which is that I'm a clinical psychologist, and part of what I do in my particular approach is we study the phenomenology of transformation. So when someone starts changing in positive ways, and there's this thing that we have observed, which we call the click of recognition. And I think it's been operative here today in a lot of different ways amongst you and probably in the audience. It's that feeling where you go, yes, that's exactly right. And you want to jump up in your chair and your eyes get bright and it's kind of wow and it's wonder. And it's a really hard thing to make happen in the sameness of the same information or the same loop or a closed system or a rigid system. And it happens all the time when I'm sitting with patients and I can see it in their face and I can see it in their eyes, and it's a deep, deep process. And so if you can figure out how to keep those kinds of moments going, you know, between people talking, between people listening, if that's in the dialogue, then people are going to start to really value this because it feels good, you know, because it gives you an emotional charge and it gives you a kind of juice for creativity. And I think that's probably where a lot of creativity comes from. It's not just from, you know, being the best at the rote equations or the best literature review person out there. You know, it's something new is coming into what you already know and enriching it in ways you can't put a formula on that, and you can't prefab it. You can't, you know, structure it. You can't figure out what it's going to be before it happens. But these kinds of dialogues, if you can convince people and then give them the experience of how good it feels, that's what's really exciting. You know, that's where the wonder comes in, and that's where the awe comes in. So I tell you that.
I think on that wonderful note, I think we should thank everybody for coming. And that's it. Thank you.
I just spent time